Good evening and welcome to the South Carolina Dialog of the International Solve Climate by 2030 event. We are thrilled to have all of you joining us from local and state government, higher education institutes, community groups, nonprofits, and more. We will begin this evening with a brief video from Bard College in New York, and these are the folks, the organizers of the Solve Climate by 2030 event, and they will help us set the stage tonight.
Welcome to the Solve Climate Global Dialogues. You're participating in one of 125 events held across the planet, including in almost all 50 U.S. states, part of a global project called Solve Climate by 2030. My name is Eben Goodstein, and I'm an economist and director of the Graduate Programs in Sustainability at Bard College in New York, the lead organizer for Solve Climate. This last year has been difficult for everyone. As the world looks forward to recovery from COVID, we are focusing tonight on the most important question facing humanity. What can we do in this year in our regions to help solve climate change while supporting struggling communities that have faced widespread loss of life, economic disaster, and joblessness? Worldwide, from Australia to Kyrgyzstan, from Colombia to Malaysia, and from South Carolina to South Africa, Solve Climate audiences are hearing from local experts and young leaders about concrete steps that can really help nations solve climate change while creating much needed jobs and incomes for everybody. The year 2020 was one of the two hottest years in human history, bringing with it massive forest and grassland fires, record-breaking storms and hurricanes, and relentless rising seas. Solving climate is the challenge which the human species must now face. There's hope for the future. Solutions have continued to advance. This year, China committed to building a carbon-neutral economy, while the U.S. rejoined the Paris Agreement. Solar, wind, and battery prices continue to fall, while major car companies have been rushing to electrify the global fleet. Worldwide, movements for Black Lives Matter and Me Too are leading in bringing much delayed and urgently needed justice to the world. Time is short. We have until 2030, 10 years to solve climate. We can get a lot done in this decade. We have the solutions, but only if we focus the world on climate solutions and justice, and then do the work we have to do in our own cities and regions. For students listening, you are the leaders. Without you, the future we envision will not come. I'm asking tonight for your help. We're going to discover powerful ideas for climate solutions and climate justice and how you can be a part of the solution. But this message must reach beyond those of us who are listening right now. Would you ask all your teachers this week in every subject to make climate a class? The teacher can assign tonight's webinar's homework for the students and then afterwards have a one-class period discussion. And we mean every subject, from art to engineering, psychology to business, dance to chemistry. Teachers don't need to be a climate expert to lead a discussion about climate change. The Solve Climate project has easy-to-use teacher's guides in nearly every subject and in 3 languages to help teachers make climate relevant to their class. It only takes courage. Don't take no for an answer. Ask them, why not? This is your future. You'll be surprised how many teachers will say yes and thank you. Imagine you, thousands of leaders like you around the world asking their teachers once every school term to make climate a class. That means every term going forwards, hundreds of thousands, millions of students worldwide in their classes talking about climate solutions. COVID has shown how fragile our global economy and society are to extreme events. It's also shown that vulnerable people are facing the hardest, most damaging impacts. This is also true with climate change. Science has made it clear that unchecked, global warming will mean an unending onslaught of extreme events, causing untold suffering for humanity and all creatures, species driven to extinction, a planet of environmental refugees. And yet, in many ways, this is the most exciting time to ever be alive as a human. We have the tools and networks and technologies to rewire the world with clean energy, reimagine the global food system, reinvent transportation, and regenerate forests and grasslands, and be well on our way to solving climate by 2030. Tonight, we will learn how to do this in our own cities, our own towns, our own regions. Thank you for the work you will do to promote climate solutions and a just world.
Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Dr. Jen Wright. I am a psychology professor at the College of Charleston, and I am going to be moderating our event this evening. I just want to remind all our attendees that you can ask questions throughout the event in the Q&A, and we will make sure that they get addressed. As we just heard in the video, universities and high school students across the planet, along with civil society, faith organizations, and businesses, are tuning in tonight to over 100 events in 50 countries that are university-hosted regional webinars that we view as critical to our future. How can an ambitious green recovery-based plan in state and local action put us in the way to solving climate change by 2030? How can we take steps to make this a reality? Climate Concern University and high school faculty worldwide and across disciplines will assign these webinars as homework, using them as a springboard for discussing regional climate solutions, energy justice, and a green recovery. What are the climate challenges facing South Carolina, from the lowcountry to the upstate? What are the pathways that South Carolina can take to mitigate and adapt to these changing climates? And why must we look at these pathways through a lens of justice and equity? Our esteemed panelists tonight will begin to answer these questions, and we'll take a look at some models that are already in place in South Carolina. Now, our first panelist is Dr. Christine Dow, who is the Carolina Trustees Professor in the Department of Geography at the University of South Carolina. She is a social justice environmental geographer focusing on understanding climate impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation, using methods involving extensive participation of stakeholders and decision makers. Dow serves as a principal investigator of the Carolinas Integrated Science and Assessments, one of 11 NOAA-supported regional integrated science and assessment teams, partnering with decision makers to bridge climate science and decision-making in support of climate adaptation strategies specific to water resources, coastal regions, and the public health concerns in the Carolinas. Dow currently serves as the co-chair of NOAA's Climate Working Group under the Science Advisory Board, and she has served as an author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and on the Southeast and Research Needs chapters for the 3rd and 4th U.S. National Climate Assessments. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Dow.
Hello, thank you. Happy to be here. Go to the next slide. So we're here on a unfortunately auspicious day. Those of you who were following the climate news today learned that this will be the year that we are 50% above the pre-industrial level of carbon dioxide as measured at the observatory in Mauna Loa. The slope of that line indicates the scale of the challenge. Go to the next slide. And it's really now, as we were saying, it's time to make a choice and to take more action. We're looking here at a contrast of temperatures between high emission scenarios and low emission scenarios in 2090, where the average daily temperature will have increased substantially. And it's time we're moving towards a public debate about what can we prevent, what are we going to adapt to and how, and what are we just going to have to live with. And the more that we prevent, the less we have to adapt and live with challenging circumstances. Next slide. So just to review, that right now we're seeing temperature shifting. Another record was broken earlier this week. These are cherry blossoms from Kyoto. They bloomed the earliest recorded, this year was the earliest recorded bloom date since the Japanese record keeping began almost 1,200 years ago. We're seeing this as a result of temperature rise. We're seeing seasons shifting and becoming longer, with more intense pollen seasons, more risk of freeze, of plants not getting enough chilling days to prepare for fruiting, and other plants and animals responding as they change. Next slide. The other thing we're looking at is more heat, and these high temperatures are rising to some extent in the daytime highs, but really most remarkably in the overnight lows. And those of you who live in the Carolinas have probably experienced that. You thought, oh, it's going to be cooler overnight, only to step outside and find it's incredibly humid, the dew point of 70 as the day starts. This is one of the this is a major environmental justice issue we need to be concerned with, because moms who are carrying children, the babies themselves and the young children are all at higher risk. Elderly, many as our population ages, are at higher risk. Those with pre-existing conditions, such as ones listed here, are at risk. And the racial disparities that we've seen in our country also extend to the impacts of heat. Next slide. We know that the sea level is rising. I put this in here to remind us of the beaches that South Carolina loves, to think about the, if you could look further down this beach, you'd probably see some umbrellas and people out sunning and playing volleyball and making sandcastles and everything else that that we love about, that's important to the tourism economy of the Carolinas and to so many jobs, as well as to the ecosystems that are represented here. Next slide. Here in Charleston, as we look out about 50 years, depending on which scenario and which uncertainties we prioritize, we're looking at somewhere between 2 to 2.5 some odd feet by 2065, just about 50 years out. And if there are more, depending on what happens with things that we don't know yet about West Antarctic ice sheets and the rate of melt of different glaciers, we may find ourselves getting there sooner than this. But we're looking for substantial rise that you'll hear about more. Next slide. In Charleston, we've already started to experience it. If you were here in 2000, you might not have experienced any of these high tide day floodings. But as we come forward each year, we see more and more of them. And again, it comes to this choice about what action we're going to take, how hard we're going to push. On the lower scenario, it might be only 45 days, this lower blue curve. If the higher admission scenario is the one that the world follows, we're looking at much higher numbers of high tide days, to 115, and then by 2100, potentially every day. And in those cases, if it's every day, they're also going to be deeper and more dangerous to work with. So we've got challenges ahead and choices to make that are increasingly well-defined. Next slide. These impacts of sea level rise and high tides are going to have broad economic impacts. Here we are at the coast of Charleston. We talking a lot about what's happening locally, but I want to connect this to the international change, to the international dimension. The state of South Carolina, from the port here in Charleston to the inland port up in Greer, trades with 195 states and territories. International trade is important to the state. We are the #1 exporter of passenger vehicles and tires in the US, and growing in other areas of specialty as manufacturing grows. This is another important dimension of our society that's dependent on climate conditions and how it affects our infrastructure. Next slide. You can't talk about climate without talking about hurricanes. This is Florence in a picture that brings out urban concentrations of areas that were captured by the spiral bands. You can see Wilmington here, Wilmington here at the red dot. Research is still evolving. but what we're seeing is pointing towards more of the stronger hurricanes and potentially wetter hurricanes that bring wetter by which I mean that they will bring with them more precipitation. And this is another announcement today, another active hurricane season. The news is full of climate change every day. Next slide. So I wanted to just sort of set the stage for the conversation with a reminder about a few of the trends that we're seeing and how they connect to life here in the Carolinas. And again, as I talk about choices, here we are at the corner of the future and our vision. And I believe that this vision can be one that recognizes the challenges, but can also be hopeful and creative. And I'm so excited to participate in a discussion that helps us begin to envision what that, or continue and to more richly envision what that might look like. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll go ahead and move to our second panelist. Our second panelist is Keisha Long, who is the Environmental Justice Coordinator for the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control, DHEC. She is an advocate for vulnerable communities and is responsible for helping environmental justice communities build capacity, identify resources, and establish collaborative partnerships. She has been with DHEC for over 20 years. Previously, she worked as a DHEC project manager in the Superfund program and the Resource and Recovery Act program. She holds a Bachelor's of Science in Civil Engineering from Clemson University and is an active Toastmaster and is also the co-chair of the advisory board of ITRC, the Interstate Technology and Regulatory Council. And I will turn it over to Keisha.
Thank you, Jen, for that introduction. And we can move on to the next slide. Just to give a quick summary of what I want to touch on, just some basics of environmental justice and equity, and then moving on to climate justice, climate mitigation and adaptation, and then some information on energy efficiency, and some projects and actions that have been going on in South Carolina and are continuing in South Carolina. So if you could move to the next slide, please. This is just a pictorial representation of equality, equity, and justice. And these are terms that we hear more and more. On the first panel, there's the equality picture where each individual is looking at a soccer game. And there's a board fencing away. Each of the spectators, they have a box, but you can see that the young person on the right can't see the game because they're not tall enough. So moving on to the middle picture, you see that everyone can see the game because everyone who needed supports got the support they needed. But you also see the person on the left in the middle picture doesn't have any supports there, which could lead to some resentment on their part. But the last picture is showing justice, and the barrier, the thing that was stopping everyone from watching the soccer game has been removed and has been replaced with a see-through fence. So that way everyone can see without supports or accommodations. So that is just basic definition of justice I like to use. If we move on to the next slide, this is the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as DHEC's formal definition of environmental justice, and just focusing on the first part heavily, fair treatment and meaningful involvement. That means all citizens are entitled to fair treatment and meaningful involvement when we as an agency develop, adapt, adopt, implement, enforce any environmental laws, regulations, and policies. The environmental justice policy actually came about in 1994 as a presidential executive order. And that executive order in part says that to the greatest extent practical and permitted by law, each federal agency shall make achieving environmental justice part of its mission by identifying and addressing disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental effects of its programs, policies, and activities on minority populations and low-income populations in the United States. And South Carolina added the last portion of this particular definition in 2007. So all fair treatment and meaningful involvement for all people in working towards increasing prosperity of all South Carolinians. So if we could go to the next slide, please. This is a screenshot I took of a program that I use called EJ Screen. Use it to look at demographics as well as locations of different environmental sites or projects such as Superfund sites, air discharges, any toxic waste sites. And this is actually a screenshot of Beaufort and St. Helena Island, Paris Island, where the Marines train. St. Helena Island is in the center of the Gullah Geechee corridor, which spans from North Carolina to Florida. And the Gullah Geechee Nation, they are an environmental justice community. And I want you to see or pay attention specifically to the left portion of this photo. It's the Broad River. And if we can go to the next slide, this is what is predicted by 2030, about 17 inches to 2 feet of sea level rise. And you can see the Broad River has expanded. It has covered up the marshlands. Paris Island has been impacted, so that impacts our national security. Of course, the Gullah Geechee Nation, their island, part of their heritage has been covered up with water. There were roads on this map that are now underwater. So climate change, as Ms. Kirsten was, or Dr. Kirsten was going through, impacts us economically, it impacts our national security, it impacts our communities. And some executive orders that have come about this year, there have been several, and there are actually 4 I'll list here that are related to climate change. There's Executive Order 13990, which is an order on protecting public health and the environment and restoring science to tackle the climate crisis. There's 14013, rebuilding and enhancing programs to resettle refugees due to climate change. And there's 14007, which is a President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. One I want to really focus on is 14008, which is tackling the climate crisis at home, and it specifically references environmental justice communities. And this executive order creates a geospatial climate and economic justice screening tool. It establishes Justice 40, which is 40% of federal investments overall are to flow to disadvantaged communities. There's an environmental justice enforcement strategy that will be instituted in the Attorney General's office. And also, this particular order is recommending that we focus our investments in areas of clean energy, energy efficiency, clean transit, affordable housing, training, and workforce development. All right, next slide, please. Just some solutions that we are going through. This is a particular project that EJ coordinator, myself, as well as other EJ leaders in the state are working on. It's EJ Strong, is funded by the EPA. And the purpose of this particular project is to have EJ communities at the center of disaster risk assessment, planning, and implementation. So this is part of the adaptation portion that Dr. Kirsten was referring to. And we are trying to empower participants to individually and collectively respond and recover from disasters effectively and efficiently. So if we go to the next slide, this is a picture of Hurricane Dorian, which was a massive storm that we experienced in the United States recently. The predictions are we will see these hurricanes more and more frequently. They will be very big, they will be very destructive. And the hurricanes, particularly along the coast and in environmental justice communities, doesn't just impact homes or businesses, it also impacts facilities that have landfills, or they have chemical storage units or air discharges. So our EJ Strong project will be focusing on hurricanes, flooding, chemical releases, and pandemics, and how community can gather its resources and respond to such natural hazards. If we can go to the next slide, please. Our intention is to work with particularly the North Charleston communities called LAMPC, and they have a nonprofit that's been working for about 10 years on affordable housing and environmental justice. And we also will be incorporating other areas in the state. EJ leaders will be part of this group, and there will be 4 workshops we're working on to do training on community managed disaster response and recovery. And then the next slide, there's LAMPC. It stands for Low Country Alliance for Model Communities. There are 7 neighborhoods of LAMPC: Accoby, Chicora, Cherokee, Union Heights, Howard Heights, Windsor Place, 5 Mile, Liberty Hill, and then the Rosemont neighborhood will also be included as a community partner in this endeavor. And moving to the next slide, our additional partners include USC, College of Charleston, and Clemson University. USC actually will be offering a certification in this particular class or classes, and also will be converting our workshops into webinars so that the entire country can benefit from these trainings. College of Charleston's Center for Coastal Environmental and Human Health will also be part of developing and delivering these trainings. And then Clemson University, during the pandemic, created a upstate food access map. We found during the pandemic that access to food was a big concern. So they actually have a map in place where you can access food pantries, restaurants, what have you. So this particular map will be expanded to the entire state as part of this project. And if you go to the next slide, just some of our products we plan to have at the end of this 2-year project are training modules. As I said before, our also we'll have community assessments of resources as well as vulnerabilities, low-lying areas, places that flood often, etc. And that will be something, products in hand that we can have at the end of this project. Next slide, please. And just a little bit about energy in South Carolina. I did work with an energy efficiency group the South Carolina Energy Office put together. And just some context, South Carolina can spend as much as 25% of their income on energy, and the national average is 3.5%. Therefore, obviously that is a big disparity and has often impacted low wealth communities. And this picture is from the South Carolina Energy Office's website. And you can see the different breakdown of who uses energy and how much. And residentially, about 23% of us use energy. And I heard this stated some years ago on a radio show, and it's the best power plant is the one you don't have to build. Therefore, no need for coal emissions, no need for natural gas, no need for nuclear or anything. But the best power plant is the one you don't have to build. And the way to do that is to save energy. So if I go to you go to the next slide, please. As part of the energy office's energy efficiency workshops, I was a part of the energy equity, energy burden group. And we came up with 3 different recommendations that could be implemented in South Carolina. The first one being label and sticker disclosures on homes. Right now, it is, if we go to the next slide, we can see what we have and what we would like. On the left, it is just a sticker on your panel inside of your utility box, and it's basically gobbledygook that you will only understand if you're a manufacturer or someone who works in energy. On the right is something that was developed by the Department of Energy, and it basically tells you if you make these improvements, this is how much money you'll save. So you'll be able to actually calculate with your the score how much money you could save if you upgraded your HVAC system, or if you did some weather stripping or weatherization at your home. Next slide, please. We found during the discussions that in order to save energy, we have to acknowledge that not everyone's home is built well or may be in disrepair. And this particular recommendation was for a one-stop shop. So anyone can go to one place, they can do one application to get funds that are available for weatherization, for home rehabilitation, for help with your energy bills, and not have to go from place to place to place to get benefits from energy efficiency upgrades. And the next slide, please. This was what we found to be a regulatory barrier. Weatherization programs exist here in South Carolina, is run by the Office of Economic Opportunity, and the community action agencies throughout the state dispense the funds. But there was a determination by the Department of Energy that in order to receive funds that are set aside by our power companies, Dominion, Duke Power, was not being utilized because it would be considered extra funding for the CAAs, and it will impact them negatively on their total funding. So they weren't using this money, and it was just sitting there, millions of dollars just sitting there. So we worked on this particular issue, and it actually has been solved. So there should be more homes, low wealth communities being weatherized, and HVAC replacements and so forth. And the last slide is my information. I apologize if I went through that really quickly, but you can call me or email me with any questions you have, and I'll turn it back over to Jen.
Wonderful. Thank you for all of that information. Really appreciate it. And we're going to go ahead and move to our third panelist to hear a little bit about a program that is currently in existence, the Center for Resilience Excellence, or CORE, in South Carolina. Our next panelist is Albert George, who has the honor of serving as the first director of conservation at the South Carolina Aquarium. During his tenure, Al formulated the South Carolina Aquarium Resilience Initiative for Coastal Education, or RICE, a strategy focused on moving beyond elite scientific and policy discussions to make the topic of resilience accessible to everyone. In this manner, RICE provides individuals and stakeholders alike with the information they need for strategic resilience planning. Al is also the founder of the Georgia Green Economy Summit, which has worked to promote green economy growth in the state of Georgia, as well as the co-founder of the Amazon Reforestation Project. He has previously served as the Director of Education for the Georgia Aquarium and has held appointments as a strategy management consultant for, is this Boaz or Booz?
Booz Allen Hamilton.
Okay, Booz Allen Hamilton. Okay, it's said like it sounds. So Booz Allen Hamilton, and is a research associate for the Center of Marine Environmental Science and Biotechnology. Al completed his BS in marine biology and chemistry from Savannah State University, as well as the prep program at Yale University, concentrating on physiology, cellular, molecular genetics. He then completed a program of study at the Harvard University John F. Kennedy School of Government at MIT, in addition to completing a Master's of Science at the Georgia Institute of Technology. So a lot of high quality education happening here. Albert currently serves as a member of the NASAM Report Committee for the Long-Term Environmental Trends in the Gulf of Mexico. So Al, take it away in terms of the core program in South Carolina.
Thank you so much. I want to say thank you to all the presenters that have presented thus far, presenting such great information. Thank you to the College of Charleston for facilitating this great discussion. And also thank the people who tuned in as attendees, because we are really counting on our youth, in particular, the next generation, to help us sort of solve these problems that are facing society. In terms of Core SC, we had the pleasure of establishing the Center of Resilience Excellence for South Carolina last year. And really the impetus behind us establishing this center is predicated on all of the information that has been shared previously by the other presenters tonight, really sort of stating I like to say, instead of challenges, the opportunities that we face as a society. So the real impetus behind Core SC being formed was in an attempt to how do we work together, not only locally, regionally, nationally, but also internationally, to bring forward the best solutions that we can put forward to help us mitigate risk. Next slide, please. And just a quick history of the Core SC movement. I want to give a shout out to Kevin Limehouse, who serves as the Innovation Officer for Charleston County. It was actually under his leadership and direction that we first begun a collaborative NASA-related regional conference that was all about tech transfer and how do we engage NASA. From that sort of foundation, Kevin reached out to us, predicated on in our work in relation to RICE, to say, how can we potentially work together to not only sort of partner better with NASA and connect better with tech transfer opportunities, but how can we leverage the South Carolina Space Grant, the NASA EPSCO program, and other related sort of existing sort of entities in the state of South Carolina that can work in a sort of integrated manner. Next slide, please. And so predicated on these principles, we really became excited about how could we sort of not just sort of create a nexus just for sort of Charleston to look at issues, but how do we create nexuses for the entire state of South Carolina? The foundational organizations that actually served as the initial founders, but again, we are not limited just to the initial founders, was Charleston County, College of Charleston, and South Carolina Aquarium. And our goal simply is how do we look both near, far, broad, and wide in relation to looking at what is the current state of the art that currently exists in the areas that are of interest that we want to mitigate risk against, that we can leverage the best thinking and come up with the best collaborations in a way to work towards the most innovative solutions. Next slide, please. And so when we think about Core SC, we have this saying, the we can. And basically, we can is just an acronym for water, basically maintaining healthy drinking water. As ridiculous as this may sound, we know of some recent examples, i.e. Flint, Michigan, where there was some examples that was not the case in the United States of America, which is almost sort of, you can't even hardly imagine that was the case, but that was the case. Mitigate coastal erosion, sea level rise, look at sort of storm water runoff, the energy component, which was articulated and was talked about earlier in relation to how do we sort of think about how do we lessen the energy burden, actually bring innovation in to sort of bring more planet-friendly, more energy that is conducive to us reducing our anthropogenic greenhouse gases. Connectivity is one of those issues that unfortunately is a part of the environmental justice issue. A lot of our sort of communities that are already challenged, when you think about what has occurred during the pandemic, where everything went to a virtual platform, you not having connectivity was basically, how could a student do their schoolwork? How could people actually, do all the things that were needed under these sort of COVID-19 conditions? So connectivity is absolutely critical. And unfortunately, is serving as a conduit now to actually serve as a way to drive divides instead of bring people closer to what the solutions that they need. And how do we sort of mitigate those risks? Agriculture definitely is one of those areas that as climate change, how do we create sort of those opportunities for us to have agricultural principles that would be sustainable, but also be able to sort of reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also be able to meet the needs of future growing populations. And of course, natural disasters and natural hazards are sort of those things that we have sort of cited multiple times throughout the course of this webinar that's currently underway. Next slide, please. So in the theme of sort of looking at natural disasters and trends, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at this trend of worldwide natural disasters to say something is going on, right? That if you look from the left to the right, you see an alarming trend. And we all know that last year was a record year in terms of named storms actually sort of arriving on our shores here in the continental US. Next slide, please. And then you saw this slide earlier that was actually presented. But the key point that I want to say here is that if we continue on our current path and at the rate in which we are releasing anthropogenic greenhouse gases, the data would have us, instead of going towards the intermediate high, unfortunately, we may be skewing now more towards the high, which would be a potential 6 to 7 feet of sea level rise by 2100 if we don't sort of abate and recalibrate, and how we can get really serious about how do we mitigate anthropogenic greenhouse gases entering into our atmosphere. Next slide, please. And when you think about this in terms of implications, the implications are very clear and very serious. When you think about just 3.28 feet of sea level rise, and you look at the yellow depicted by how much, the red that would be depicted by how much that would impact the southeast related area, the southeast coast, you just see a future that we can't even hardly imagine. And so for a lot of people who out there who may not think that, we're at that critical tipping point, or we're at a point that we need to have urgent action, you just take a look at this map for just what happens or what areas are inundated under 3.28 feet of sea level rise scenarios. And hopefully that would be a cogent, salient moment where you realize what we are really at a serious situation where we need action. Next slide, please. And so with that in mind, one of the things that we're working on, and one of the things I have the honor of working on as part of the CORE-SC and as part of my role as Director of Conservation here at the South Carolina Aquarium, is that we are endeavoring currently to think about what are the current data gaps that persist that would allow us to help counties and city municipalities better prepare for these future scenarios. Next slide, please. And one of the key things that we're excited to do, and we're excited to be currently working on, is working on 3D inundation supercomputer modeling. And I have the honor and pleasure of serving as the co-PI with Dr. Harry V. Wing from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science to work towards how do we bring some of the best technology in the world where we can actually model not only future storm-related events, not only model future sea level rise, but also model what potential implications around future built environment structures, what we can do to modify green infrastructure, and put it into one system that will best give us the best chance of really having a systems-based approach of how do we sort of peer into the future, leverage the best technology, and help places like Charleston, Beaufort, Savannah, and the whole South Atlantic corridor actually think about how do we proactively mitigate these risks using some of the best technology in the world. And so with that being said, I would like to turn it back over to our wonderful moderator, Thank you for your time and attention. And I'm excited about the opportunity for us to work together to make a more resilient future here in the great state of South Carolina. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Al, for all of that. Lots to think about, lots of questions percolating. So our final, last but not least, panelist, Dr. Elizabeth Fly, is going to talk to us a little bit about advancing equitable nature-based solutions for resilience. Dr. Fly is the Marine Conservation Director of the South Carolina chapter of the Nature Conservancy. She's expanding the Conservancy's engagement in important coastal and offshore issues facing South Carolina, including using nature-based solutions to mitigate flood risk, encouraging smart ocean use decisions, and supporting sustainable fisheries. She's originally from St. Louis, Missouri, and has been living in South Carolina for 14 years working on marine-related issues. She received her PhD in biological sciences from the University of South Carolina, studying climate change impacts on marine mussels around the world. Liz spent a year in Washington, D.C. I keep seeing South Carolina at everything I'm looking at. As the Marine, so then is it NAUS? Marine Policy Fellow, working on ocean and coastal issues for the third National Climate Assessment that was released in 2014. And I am going to now turn it over to Dr. Fly.
Great, thank you so much, Jen, and good evening, everybody. Really appreciate you all joining in, and thank you to the College of Charleston for hosting this event, and to the great panelists that have spoken before me. So Jen, mentioned what I'm going to be talking about, really focusing on nature-based solutions. And so just these couple of slides that are going to get flipped through here. This is what climate change looks like in South Carolina. These are the storms that have happened in the last 5 to 6 years that have really kind of, I think, woken the state up to what is happening. Certainly in terms of hurricanes or major storms, the state had kind of dodged a bullet since Hurricane Hugo, but then, since 2015, year after year after year, these storms have hit us. They've really highlighted our vulnerabilities. As the other panelists have already mentioned, of course, underserved communities are disproportionately impacted by these types of events, and aren't really given or offered the same resources as some of the wealthier communities. These storms have also really highlighted our weaknesses and our failures in our infrastructure throughout the state. And I think that this has really led people to start thinking that, business as usual is not working anymore. The solutions that we've used in the past are not necessarily the solutions we should be using in the future. And so people are starting to think, I guess, outside of the box a little bit. And so what, maybe another pipe or another seawall or another big concrete ditch is not the solution that we need anymore. So, I think what people kind of innately know, but we're not putting into practice enough, is that nature has solutions for these types of issues. And if you go to the next slide, nature, and when we talk about flooding in particular, which is what we've been seeing a lot of in the last 5 to 6 years, nature has flood solutions. And these are just some examples, but we know that marsh can, buffer storm surge coming in and stop shoreline erosion if we have healthy marsh. We know that wetlands can do the same, and it's been shown that they've prevented millions and millions of dollars in property damages from flooding. Having trees can slow down floodwaters in areas compared to asphalt, but even compared to lawns. And just having trees can help with stormwater issues, because trees can lift hundreds of gallons of water out of the ground in a day. Like I said, just a few examples, but nature is resilient and has been dealing with flooding and natural hazards for years, and has those solutions. And if you go to the next slide, the other thing about nature is that it provides multiple benefits. So a seawall is a seawall. It can protect a shoreline against erosion, but that's pretty much all it does. When something like a living shoreline, which is healthy marsh, oyster reefs, can provide multiple benefits, of course, buffering that wave energy, helping the shoreline stop eroding, but also habitat for marine life, building up that healthy marsh, water quality and filtration, for example. So multiple benefits. And this slide here is showing that huge range of benefits that nature can provide. And this goes from things like health and well-being, reducing pollution, creating recreational opportunities, creating economic opportunities, certainly in terms of energy efficiency, providing cooling from urban heat effect if you have trees there. Of course, I'm mostly focusing on climate adaptation, but climate mitigation opportunities with nature are huge as well in terms of carbon sequestration through forests and salt marshes and mangroves. And even quality of life and having a pride in your community and getting outside are not to be understated. I think certainly in the last year when we've all been kind of locked down, getting out into nature has been a huge benefit to all of us. So I can't really stress this enough, but just the value of nature providing these multiple benefits. Next slide. So when I talk about nature-based solutions, when we've been looking at reducing flood impacts, we are focusing on these multiple benefits. We're focusing on that flood risk reduction, but then we are looking to provide ecological benefits, to provide those multiple benefits, but also then the community assets that come along with that. But there are major barriers to getting really any project in the ground, gray infrastructure or green infrastructure that communities in South Carolina are facing, and certainly our underserved communities are facing those challenges, those barriers even more. So if you go to the next slide, this is my really pathetic attempt at an infographic, so pardon that. But as I mentioned, in the past 5 or so years, we've had these presidentially declared disasters in South Carolina year after year after year. A quote unquote positive that has come out of that, if you can call it that, is that there are hundreds of millions of dollars coming to our state now in terms of post-disaster funding. And so we have this huge opportunity to capitalize on this opportunity. This money is meant to either get people back in their homes and businesses by repairing them, getting people out of harm's way by buying out those homes, as well as then helping with infrastructure, both gray and green opportunities to put infrastructure in the ground to help these communities. But there are a lot of barriers. Hold on, keep it on that last slide. There are a lot of barriers to getting this money, especially for small communities. The grant process is very burdensome. There's low capacity for grant applications in small communities. Big cities like Charleston have a grants writer on staff, but many communities don't have that. So having the capacity to even write grants is a challenge. And then this big orange X there is a big one, cost share requirement. So a lot of federal money coming down requires a 25% cost share from local communities. That is a lot of money on these very expensive projects. And a lot of communities just don't have that money to spend to provide for that cost share requirement. And so what that has meant, that recent study showed that this is nationwide, but 35% of the FEMA disaster funding that's come to states in the past several years has not been spent. And a big reason for that is this cost share requirement. That's a huge barrier to many communities. So I just want to really quickly give you a sense of what this looks like on the ground and how we're trying to get some green infrastructure, natural solutions in the ground as well in a small town. So if you go to the next slide, this is the town of Andrews. You can see there in the map, it's on the edge of Georgetown County. And it's a small town, about 3,000 people, and it has been hit hard year after year after year with these flooding issues. But one problem are all those barriers that I mentioned before in terms of capacity to write grants, capacity to just deal with all this beyond the everyday, and that cost share requirement. I mean, they don't even really know what the problem is. They don't even know where all their stormwater ditches and drains are, which is a big problem. And so they had this opportunity to get FEMA funding to do a study of all their stormwater ditches and drains to understand where the problems were, but they couldn't provide the match for that project. So the Nature Conservancy in Georgetown County helped provide the funding to provide that match so that they could get that study done. And that is a huge thing in a number of county and a number of communities around South Carolina, is just understanding where the problems are so that they can then be addressed. So if you go to the next slide, they were able to conduct that study and came up with $12 million worth of big infrastructure projects that will alleviate the flooding in the town of Andrews, in the small town of Andrews. So again, that's a huge barrier and a lot of money to find in the future. They are moving forward with applying for this first project here that will alleviate flooding in 118 acres of the town. It will create a new outfall. But this is, again, it's going to take years and is going to require that 25% match. So what we are working, if you'll go to the next slide right now, is to get some green infrastructure in the ground in this community. Green infrastructure is almost always much significantly cheaper than gray infrastructure projects. So it's something you can do faster, you can get it in the ground, you can often have the community participate in the putting it in the ground, sorry. But so the picture here, this is a rain garden, the plant picture there, and the map above it shows us this area in Andrews where we've cited this will be a perfect place to put this rain garden in. We'll have a big community event. We'll also distribute rain barrels to public buildings and citizens. We'll have a community event where kids and whoever can come out and decorate those rain barrels. And so, like I said, this is really an opportunity to have some green solutions. It's going to beautify this area. It's going to develop this sense of community pride. It's going to be a great place for people to come out. It's not going to fix all of the flooding, but it's going to be a help. The people around there aren't going to have water standing in their yards anymore after big rain events, and it's going to again have that community pride and an education component to it as well. So if we go to the next slide, I'm just going to wrap up here with, these are examples of what I call nature-based solutions. And you can see they're kind of wide ranging. It's really just an opportunity to get nature back into the ground, give it kind of a kickstart and let nature do its own thing. And the way I'm pairing that with communities like Andrews is that we want to go in, we want to give help, communities have a little kickstart of getting some projects on the ground, even if it's that step of getting a study done to understand where the problems are, so then they can then identify solutions down the road and we can look to find funding in the future. So I think I'm going to leave it there, and I appreciate it and look forward to any questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for some really stimulating conversations. And actually, we do have some questions coming in that I'd like to put out there. The first one is, what are some of the mitigation and adaptation strategies for non-coastal South Carolina communities related to increasing temperatures and some of the heat island issues? I mean, obviously we've talked about flooding. Flooding is near and dear to all of our hearts living on the coast and elsewhere, but what about some of the other climate effects that we can expect to see?
I mean, it goes back to green infrastructure, in my humble opinion. One way to reduce the heat island is basically to increase the sort of tree canopy and those wonderful things that Liz talked about. And it's proven, this science is hard and proven. It's proven that basically, if you have a tree canopy and green infrastructure in a given urban landscape, not only does it increase the ability to absorb rain and all those other things that Liz talked about, but you talk about reducing heat indexes in an attributable amount that could actually be life-saving. So I would say green infrastructure. And again, I yield to my panelists who want to sort of dig deeper on it.
I'd just add green infrastructure where we can put in green infrastructure, but we've also got such amazing amount of growth in Charleston area that thinking about green roofs is another option. They don't necessarily have to be green. You can start them out good if they're white and highly reflective, particularly if they're flat. And then you're cutting down the heat island, you're cutting down energy consumption and mitigating the climate change problem overall. So you can do both sides of the coin.
They nailed it. I don't have anything to add.
Can we just, and we could think more about pervious pavement, all that asphalt. Oh, there are better ways, right?
There are. I've started using the term greening the community in terms of just like wherever possible, getting green in there. So that's green roofs, that's trees, that's taking out your totally concrete driveway and putting in pervious pavers. And then you can add more gardens around that. And so, it adds up to a bigger solution, even if you feel like it's small scale.
So that's related to another question that I have, which is the intersection between this idea of green infrastructure, these green interventions, and how that ties into other sorts of important climate action like buildings, transportation, waste management. And I wanted to hear if there were any thoughts of the panelists of how the green infrastructure piece fits into some of those other major initiatives as well.
The thing I would just chime in quickly and say that the thing that frustrates me most about this is that the technology is proven and it exists, right? That, you know, we already have, it's not like we're looking out a technology that doesn't exist. So I just want to first posit that. And in terms of, you know, to me, it's all about net zero. In order for us to be able to mitigate most of the harm that we're looking at potentially in future implications of climate change, the sooner we can reach net zero as communities, as companies, as, you know, households, that's really going to be the ultimate, you know, sort of force that can sort of help us reconcile future damage. And in order to do that, you got to figure out how you're going to either reduce your GHGs, greenhouse gases, or how can you remove your greenhouse gases. And to me, green infrastructure, whether it's trees, whether it's wetlands, whether it's, you know, you doing a home garden, you having a green roof, all of those things add up to the net zero equation, which we have to work towards.
Did anyone else have some thoughts about that one, or should we move to the next question?
I'll chime in, Jen, briefly and just say that, you know, Al's right. And it's proven. And I think there's a lot of like long-term taking these green infrastructure approaches, these greener approaches, these energy efficient approaches, and whatever industry you're talking about, long-term, they pay off. There may be an initial investment, which I think scares a lot of people away from change, and change is hard, right? But scares a lot of people away from making these changes initially. But we need to be better about showing how long-term this is going to pay off if you switch to these better practices.
Okay, thank you for that. So another question that we have.
Before we move on, just really.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
I just the discussion reminded me of something that happened to me 15 years ago. I was in Memphis taking a tour, and the tour guide mentioned some historic homes that were built to be climate controlled without air conditioning because of the materials they used. So our solutions may be in the past, not necessarily bigger whiz-bang technology things, but old-fashioned things, like we were saying, planting a tree could help with climate change. So just not just think about the Star Trek solutions, but also just the wagon and buggy solutions.
Yeah, that's a tremendously important point, because a lot of the thought that went into how do you keep a house cool, or how do you keep a house warm, or how do you keep food cool, these sorts of things are things that problems we've already solved. So just like nature has already solved these problems in a number of ways, we ourselves have solved these problems in a number of ways before, and that's important to remember. So another question that we have, are you all aware of updated septic tank designs that will continue to function during larger rain events, not necessarily coastal flooding, just heavy rain?
I have a feeling that's something directed to me because I work for DHEC and we do septic tanks, but I'm not up on the latest septic tank designs, unfortunately. I don't have an answer. I know there are different technologies that have been out for a while, including, you know, low flow toilets, and even there's the toilets that don't use water at all. But I on specific designs, I don't know.
Okay, so we have another question. Has anyone forecast the cost of all the measures needed to be taken by 2030? So if we're really shooting for 2030 as being the, you know, as we're pushing for not only, you know, carbon neutral, but maybe even drawdown. Has anyone forecast that, or even part of it, like all the green and gray solutions for coastal communities, the total match dollar requirements? Getting a grasp on the scale would help with crafting solutions and getting help from the South Carolina legislature.
But can we recast that a little bit, in the sense that I think, no one has actually come up with that actual aggregate number, because I think we're still, in a lot of cases, like Liz communicated, it's a lot of communities don't have even the wherewithal to do that type of analysis. They don't even have the means to actually calculate what would be the harm, needs to say what would be the mitigation steps. But only thing I would ask us to do, and I get passionate about this, is that instead of looking at it as a cost, you got to ultimately look at it as risk mitigation. Like, it's the cost of what if we don't do anything, what's going to happen to our economic basis, what's going to happen to not only the South Carolina economy, but the global economy. And I know the World Resource Institute just came out with a report a couple of years ago that basically said you could potentially look at an impact of the global GDP if we don't plan for the impacts of climate change. There'll be something of a reduction of maybe like almost 10% of the global GDP. That the global GDP is over $80 trillion. So if, think about that. I mean, so I'm not just about aggregation of how much it costs, but I'm thinking about if we don't spend the money to mitigate risk, what it's going to ultimately cost us if we keep on the course as business as usual.
Yeah, I mean, at my unpaid evening job is being the co-chair of the Charleston Climate Coalition. And this is one of the things that is really frustrating and difficult for us, is just the degree to which the work that we want to see done and the work that we know, Charleston City Council, the County Council, the work that we both want to see done and other people want to see done is going to be almost impossible given how underfunded and understaffed people are. And that's one of the challenges that we're definitely going to have to be addressing. So we have a question. I think, Liz, this is going to be for you based on your slides. Could you please give a brief explanation of the benefits of this sediment reuse? That was one of the things that was on your slides.
Sure. Yes, so we call it beneficial use of sediment. And so oftentimes, so the Army Corps and other even local agencies are dredging waterways to keep them deep enough for boats to come by. And oftentimes that sediment just gets dumped somewhere. It gets dumped upland on an island or some piece of land, or it gets taken out into the ocean into a disposal site. So there's been work in the last, I don't know how long it's been now, but to figure out beneficial ways to reuse that. And so one example is called thin layer placement, and that's spreading a thin layer of the sediment over marshes to help them accrete up and keep up with sea level rise. And then another example is to place it on eroding beaches or sea islands or things where there's nests for birds and things.
Excellent, thank you for that. So we have another question. It was framed as a comment, but I'm going to transform it into a question. So some major cities like Philadelphia and Portland have invested heavily in green solutions to stormwater. And these might be good sources for lessons learned and best practices. And I just wanted to open it up to the panelists. If you had to point to a city, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere, that you think really has it together in terms of a model that we should be trying to emulate, Charleston, South Carolina, or any other city in South Carolina, what would you point to as being a good model for how we need to be moving, where we need to be going?
I guess there are cities that have done amazing things, in Holland particularly, where the concept is to live with water. Our shoreline isn't quite the same. And you can do some of that. I think what we're going to need to do is learn from our neighbors. Norfolk is ahead of us. They've been working at this a little bit longer, confronting some of the issues a little bit sooner than we are. And I don't think that they're where they want to be yet, but I do think that we're going to learn a lot from the places like that.
Anyone else have a place that they like to point to as a good example of things we can be doing?
I will say I don't know a lot because I am coastal focused, but I do agree. I think places like Philadelphia are good for cities like Columbia and more inland cities to look at, to see what they're doing. There's a lot of cities that have, a lot of places have in the past maybe 5 to 10 years have developed great resilience plans. And so you can point to a lot of those around the country. I think the harder part now is the implementation of those plans, and that's where I think a lot of us are struggling. But we are seeing progress around the country. Louisiana and New Orleans kind of was forced into it, but has been doing some great things as well. Certainly Louisiana, the state, in terms of like watershed level planning, has been really effective. We've certainly learned that water doesn't stick to jurisdictional boundaries. So planning on an ecological watershed scale makes a lot more sense. And yes, the Dutch, like Kirsten said, if some of you know, Charleston took part in the Dutch Dialogues process and brought some Dutch experts over to provide some advice as well. And a lot of that is nature focused as well. So we're trying to implement some of those.
So as a professor, I have a question that I want to ask. I mean, one of the things I really appreciate about the Solve Climate by 2030 model is that it involves universities in this discussion, because it seems to me that we're a resource that's being somewhat underutilized in this endeavor. And so a question I'd like to put to all of you is, how do you think that universities can best support the work that needs to be done, both at the governmental level and all of the organizations that are working? How can universities best support the work that needs to be done? And in particular for our students that are both on the panel now and will be watching this later, what would your recommendations be to them in terms of getting involved and getting the education they need to be effective in this area, since this is going to be hitting them front and center in their lives?
One resource I like to point to is a program by the EPA. It's the CUP program. It stands for College Underserved Community Partnership Program. And what it is a collaborative partnership between a university and a community. And as a previous panelist was stating about match funds and not having the money to even do a resiliency plan. And the purpose of this program is to pair a university class that's probably doing a capstone project as part of their degree with a community that needs help with environmental solution, or maybe they're a plant or some broadband. I mean, it spans the high as the sky in terms of imagination, but the students work on a plan for the community gets the solution, the student gets the credits, and the community gets basically a free professional product at the end. And I'll be happy to share the contact information with you. Her name is Benita Johnson. She runs that program for the EPA.
Excellent, thank you, that'd be wonderful. Anyone else want to chime in on their thoughts about either how universities can best support this work? And I mean, it's kind of a separate question in a way, what your recommendations would be for students?
So I think for my students, what I'd like them to do is to get out and begin to understand the complexity of it and to understand how climate fits into everything they do. We opened with a conversation that said you could teach it in any class. And I think helping them see that opportunity in so many ways to bring this dimension into the work that they're pursuing is there. So maybe it's just one class, but using your creativity to see how it connects to where you want your life's work to go so that you pursue that in a way that's climate informed. And I think universities could do a lot more to facilitate that in having days like that that are available for different disciplines.
I would say, if we could, and I'm not trying to take a shot, but if we could put as much energy as we put into sports as we do in really getting people fired up to be problem solvers and world changers and using their God-given intellectual ability to actually impact, human society, if we can have that type of energy put into how do we champion and promote and engage young people and inspire them to say, you need to work at your gifts, the way we do in sports, work at your gifts every day with the hope that you could bring forward your ultimate best to help advance your team. And And I don't think there's no better team than the human race, right? You know, that we're all in this together. If we don't come up with the solutions, we all are losers. And if I was a student, you know, and I'm a future, you know, was a past, you know, athletic guy, I'm more excited about my future now as a person working in this field than I was ever about any sport I ever played. So if we could just survive that type of confidence, energy, and support and motivation to engage all, regardless of your representation, to be participatory and excited and say we're going to solve these problems and we're going to get excited and we're going to have that energy level, I think that would be a major paradigm shift in America and in the world.
I'm just going to say hallelujah to that because I wholeheartedly agree and I think it's really critical. So we have a couple questions that it might be a little bit more sensitive in nature, but we have someone who would be interested in hearing what people's attitudes or thoughts about the seawall that's been proposed for Charleston. What are people's thoughts about the seawall? What are aspects of it that we're excited about, or what are some of the problems that we see with it? Does anyone have an opinion that they'd be willing to share?
Oh, I'll take the bait a little bit at least. Well, it's if you approach it from an academic angle, it's a fascinating situation, right? Charleston's dealing with this, what they keep calling existential crisis of this flooding. This study is really looking at kind of that worst case scenario of another giant storm coming in, and the purpose is to protect lives and property. So that storm surge barrier is meant to protect lives and property in the event of that, big storm coming. We've just mentioned the Dutch dialogues just happening, where it's much more taking this holistic view of water planning, not just storm surge, not just rainfall, everything together. How do we, do all these approaches that can kind of handle all of this at once? And so I think it's felt to a lot of people that this storm surge barrier isn't that kind of holistic planning, as well as, the people feel that a giant, whatever 8-foot wall or encircling the peninsula is problematic for a number of reasons. And so there's a push to see if you can incorporate more, natural solutions in that, see if there's way to include more cultural and historic, angles in there, making sure that the more underserved communities are not left out in any way. It's super complicated. Certainly if you're looking at a 15-foot storm surge, just having marsh is not going to provide the protection that an 8-foot wall would. So I don't have a good answer for you, but those are kind of, the things that I know people are grappling with in this discussion. But certainly the Peninsula of Charleston is at a huge risk. And if there is opportunity to get some funding to help with some of that flooding, I see why people are exploring this potential opportunity. But there's certainly, I think, a long way to go, and people being able to provide input and coming up with the right design for the area.
Anyone else?
I think that's great. I think one of the things that might go with that is thinking about how long that investment is likely to serve us. And if we're going to spend that amount of money, what aren't we going to spend on? What's the sell-by date? If we see that 6 feet that was mentioned earlier, 8-foot wall, doesn't take much of a storm to top that. And then what we have is sunk risks. And we have sort of created a moral hazard of making people feel more secure than they are. So that's not an answer either. It's just another dimension to a really thorny problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can appreciate that. Any other thoughts about that? So I just want to say thank you to Kelly for sharing in the chat. We have the resource to the city of Charleston just came up with their climate action plan draft, and that's available for you to take a look at there. I think there may also still be a survey that is circulating for people to weigh in on what they would want to prioritize in terms of that plan. It's worth getting community involvement there. And thank you, Keisha, for sharing the EPA link that you had mentioned. So one last question, and this actually, it ties a little bit into the wall. It also ties into the graph that Al showed us of what we're looking at in terms of potential sea level rise, because part of the conversation that doesn't seem to be happening as much as you might think it would be is the ultimate migration off the coast. And so I wanted to hear some thoughts, because I certainly have people that are, that I talk to on a regular basis that are very much on the side of, doing as much as we can to mitigate and reduce risk. And then people that are like, the conversations that we need to be having about living in Charleston are where we're going to be relocating to. And those are certainly conversations that are a bit less popular, but I wanted to hear your thoughts as a group on at what point do we start having more serious conversations about relocation of populations as we begin to recognize the 2100 seems far away now, but in terms of what it's going to take to relocate populations, that doesn't actually give us a lot of time. What are some of your thoughts about that?
I'm just going to chime in right quick. I think one of my biggest concerns is that if you don't have a plan for the least, in terms of the least resource people, you don't have a plan for the most. And then when you factor in, when you think about the Gullah Geechee populations that actually have heirs property, which they don't have in a lot of cases, clear titles to land, how do you make sure that it's an equitable reallocation of resources or repositioning? And then when you layer in institutional racism, when you lay in sort of a sense that a lot of these communities are under siege under normal circumstances for developmental purposes, it doesn't take a whole heck of a lot to say, I would be sort of leery of anyone coming to my community talking about these type of things without a concrete plan on how you're going to have reconciliation for those people who are still sort of under siege and have the longest standing relationship with the land outside of the indigenous people, who were here. So my only sort of statement would be, we need to start having those conversations now. And it can't just be about how do we just take care of the most affluent. The real question is, how do we take care of those people who have been here the longest, minus, the indigenous population, who may not be the most well resources, but at the same time, call this place home and have been here creating this cultural ethos called the South Carolina lowcountry for over 400 years. How do we make them whole? Rather than just saying we need to make a move, we need to think about how we could do it with those equity principles that Keisha Long talked about earlier in the presentation.
Yeah, so critical. Thank you for bringing that up. Any other thoughts from other panelists?
I'd like to see us do it better. A woman I talk with sometimes, Reverend Susanna Tuttle, up in North Carolina, but when she talks about this, she says, how do we make this a hopeful future? What is it going to be that's better than the suffering of having to relocate a community? And how are we going to think about what a community could optimally look like? So I'll go back to that future and vision. Let's maybe there's negative sides to that, but how could we make it a positive? What's possible that will address some of the existing problems of old wooden infrastructure? Are we going to put new infrastructure in where these old wooden logs have been serving? Are we going to do something that's really lovely and enduring and supports everyone in a more equitable and sustainable way? So I want us to start thinking about that as part of the vision. And I absolutely agree that we've got a lot of work to do before we can start to have a decent conversation about what's possible. But it's while we're getting ourselves some time, we need to be building a vision.
Excellent, thank you. So we have one last question. I think we'll close out with this question from our audience. How can we activate, or I'm going to say aggravate, for changes in commercial development practices and policies that are not sustainable and are posited to cause harm to our most vulnerable populations? And Al, this is coming back to what you were saying a moment ago, that We have a lot of communities that are quite vulnerable to the practices that are currently going on. How do we change that? How do we work to protect ourselves against the sort of development that is going on that is contributing to this problem?
I'll chime in to say it's multifaceted, but I certainly think going back to again the thinking about, I guess, going to incentives and figuring out ways to incentivize smart development, green development that helps those underserved communities rather than puts them in greater harm's way, is certainly going to be a part of that equation. But I want to hear from my other panelists as well.
So I think about how we can do development that gets us closer to this known impact. What is it bringing in? Is it possible that it actually, let's think outside the box and say, what if when we build, we're going to use materials that capture carbon in them, and that the buildings themselves are part of a solution, and that the landscaping requirements anticipate those big trees in 100 years. They're going to be taking Liz's 100 gallons a day out of the soil. And where do we, how do we encourage green roofs so that we're not putting more pervious surface up right there, but we're actually filtering water, conserving that, returning it, and doing the same with pervious pavement and mitigating the heat island effect as well. I think pushing towards that green building, green design as we go forward is going to be an important piece of that.
I hear that. Does anyone else have something that they want to offer along those lines?
Yes, just as my background being in civil engineering and building things, we as a society have to make choices on what we want to buy. And the choice shouldn't always be what's the cheapest, but what's really the best. And often what's best is expensive. So the green solutions are out there. They have to be more prevalent. They have to be, but we also have to choose them. We have to choose to purchase these things because that's businesses is about profit. So they follow the crowd. So if the crowd is going to green technology, green sustainable cars or homes or landscaping, then that's what they'll build. So we do have the power to change it, but we have to collectively decide that this is what we want and what we need. Otherwise, it's just going to be status quo.
I think this is it's an interesting place that the power of the government can use its investments to incentivize that and help those skill sets develop and become demonstrations. I was the faculty principal at the green building at the University of South Carolina that was made back in 2003. And they wrote into the contract that they would give preference to the people who had green solutions and had experience with green solutions. It was before there was a South Carolina Green Building Council, but we've got one now. I think just echoing Keisha's point, there are ways that you can incentivize that kind of expertise, and people will. Some people will do it for business reasons, and some people will do it because they become fascinated and realize the opportunities to do good.
But I think to bring it full circle and to echo what Keisha said, and then take it back to the students who are here, I think the bottom line is for you young people who are listening, do a better job than us at demanding what would be a more sustainable future. Demanding companies think about the total life cycle of a product. Be more demanding than we were in terms of demanding that these options become the option instead of one of many options that you have to choose from. So I just want to encourage the young people who are still here listening. The power is in your hand. You are the future. They will listen to you if you vote with your dollars on what you sort of deem the most important.
I think that's a really, really critical message and a really wonderful place to end. Darcy, you mentioned that you have a slide you want to put up that has contact information for all of our panelists. So for those of you who want to hear more or get in touch with the people that we've heard from tonight, all the wonderful stuff that we've learned about, don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you so much for joining us this evening for this event. And hopefully this is the beginning or a continuation of a conversation and certainly not the end.
Thanks all.
Yes, thank you so much to our panelists for coming.
Appreciate
And thank you for
everyone.
Absolutely.
For the opportunity.
Have a wonderful evening.